such an environment does exist in some states because the government allows it. In a free and civil society that America is supposed to be, how did this situation come about? Well, long story short, it's the legacy of those politicians who allowed themselves to be seduced by labor union money and labor union political support and turned their back on the American principles of individual liberty, economic freedom, and limited government. As a result, thanks to certain pieces of legislation, executive orders, and court decisions, labor unions are now legally allowed to function as little more than extortion rackets operating under government protection. The most significant piece of legislation was the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. Just to give you a little history here. Because you know, you may not know this, but a few years ago, when the Democrats were running the showdown in Madison, they passed some legislation requiring the public schools to teach the history of collective bargaining. Well, I went to my assembly representative's little office hours, as she called it, at the public library. Sometimes she'd have it in a coffee shop downtown or whatever. But I went because I read about this. And at that time, it was Penny Bernard Shaver. I don't know if that name rings a bell, but she was the assembly rep in Appleton up until recently when she tried to run for Senate, and Roger Roth cleaned her clock, thankfully. And but I asked, okay, Penny, why did you pass this legislation? Now, if I remember correctly, when I was going through junior high school, I had to take U.S. history classes, and I remember like Samuel Gompers and the Haymarket Riot and George Meany and the AFL-CIO and all this kind of stuff. So why was this legislation deemed necessary or whatever? She said, well, it was sitting on the agenda for a long time. It was sitting in the hopper, and the labor unions wanted us to pass it, and so we just thought it's about time we acted on it. I said, well, how is this going to be implemented? Who's going to develop the curriculum for this history segment of our U.S. history class? Is, for example, the National Right to Work Committee going to have a seat at the table to make sure that there's balance in the curriculum? Well, I don't know. I said, well then, why did you vote for this? And she gave me the answer I just told you, that it was in the hopper and the unions wanted it and blah, blah, blah. I said, well, if you don't know how this is going to be implemented, and it's already being taught in the schools, why did you vote for it? And again, it was just the circular argument, and you just throw up your hands and just hope for the best. So, anyway, this diabolical situation got going particularly during the FDR administration with the New Deal and the National Labor Relations Act and so on and so forth. And part of this evolution where labor unions started becoming more and more important in our society, or playing more of a role, it didn't happen obviously overnight. It took a long time. It happened over many decades because once upon a time, labor unions had virtually zero influence in our society because most people were farmers. And the labor unions like to talk about, hey, thank the labor unions for the weekend. Well, what about unionizing the farmers so that they can have a weekend? Are the cows just going to take care of themselves? I mean, whoever even thought of having a weekend? Because once upon a time, there was no such thing. The weekend only came about because our society changed from an agricultural society to more of an urban and industrialized society. Human productivity expanded, became greater, improved, so that now we could produce more things with fewer man hours. And so we had the opportunity for a bit more leisure time. We could actually have a weekend. The unions make it sound like if it weren't for them, there would be no labor, no weekend. That's like saying, you know, if we hadn't fought the Civil War, we'd still have slavery. I don't think so. We're the only country in the history of the world that had to fight a war to get rid of slavery. Labor unions like to say, thank us for getting rid of child labor. Well, you know, they sound so altruistic. Oh, those children, we did it for the children. No, they didn't. They did it because to a unionized worker, to a labor union, child labor is competition. They wanted to get rid of child labor to get rid of competition, not out of the goodness of their heart. And like any other argument in this regard, these kind of social changes only happen when it's possible for them to happen. Child labor, there are places in Africa and in India, if you took away child labor, the family would starve. Child labor is a luxury in some places. When children are old enough to work, they work. They don't go out and play. Children in America and Europe and places like first world countries, they have that luxury because we have a very productive economy. And so we can afford these kinds of luxuries. But it takes time to reach that stage before we can have these kinds of luxuries. You know, in the past, workers didn't make low wages because there were no unions. Workers made low wages because their productivity was low. And it was only later, with automation and advances in technology, the assembly line and so forth, that allowed us to have weekends, the 40-hour work week. You know, the unions like to talk about how Henry Ford paid his workers $5 a day because he was so enlightened, you see, and he understood that workers needed to make $5 a day in order to buy his cars. No, that's not the story. They show you that only one side of the coin. They don't want you to see the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is when he was paying less than $5 an hour, Henry Ford's turnover of his workforce was 400% annually. That means he was going through his entire workforce every 3 months. That was terrible for productivity. It just screwed up production. So what he decided to do, he said, okay, I'm going to pay higher wages, but I'm going to be very selective in who I hire. And his personnel people would go and visit prospective labor workers in their homes to see what their home life was like and really dig into their personal habits and find out a lot about their background. And then he hired just the very best people. And he paid them $5 an hour. And turnover went virtually down to zero. And production skyrocketed, even though he was paying more money. The profits zoomed. So that's, you know, as Paul Harvey says, and now you know the rest of the story. So, okay, back to our story. Every once in a while I'm going to digress, you know, I'll go off on a little sidebar, you know, so. Because I presume you guys just don't want me to stand up here and read off the paper. So, okay. One of the things that was very pivotal in getting labor unions to have government support was that the government made a decision that labor would not be considered a commodity. In other words, we will let the forces of supply and demand in the economy determine the price of everything. A chair, a table, light bulb, you know, anything. Except one thing, the price of labor. That's not a commodity. That's not subject to supply and demand forces in the economy. That is subject to negotiation. That's what they came up with. Because, and this is something I picked up too when I was down in Madison, given and listening to testimony. I was sitting here for hours just, you know, listening to other people talk, pro and con on right to work. And those who were pro right to work would sometimes talk about the costs to the business, the cost to the employer. And there were a couple of Democrats on the panel, and he got on his moral high horse and he said, you know, what you call costs, we call wages. You know, as if you're the bad guy. You're using the bad word cost. We're using that nice word wages. Wages, that's good. Wages sounds virtuous. You're talking about cost like it's something terrible. Well, one man's wages is another man's costs. And actually, labor is a commodity. The laborer is not a commodity. He's not a slave. He's a human being. But his labor is a commodity. And he enters the economy willing to trade his labor for a wage. So even though the government politicians and the labor union guys, they get on their moral high horse and say, the work of a human being is not a commodity. Labor is not a commodity. But the guy who's in the workforce and he's going around trying to find a job, he views his labor as a commodity. He's trying to sell it for the highest wage he can get, for the highest price he can obtain. He views his labor as a commodity. It's just word games they play, to play on your emotions and so forth. Well, then things progressed, and with the notion that labor is not a commodity but has to be negotiated, the price of labor has now to be negotiated. Now, it's not just a matter of level playing field, employer-employee can just get together and negotiate. No, the government now says the employer has to negotiate. And that means not just sit down and like this. No. The employer has to offer concessions, has to come back with a counter offer. Can't just say no. He's got to deal with the labor union. He can't just say, well, this is a free country. I don't want to deal with the labor union. I'll just hire somebody else. No. You have to deal with the labor union. That's the rule. That's the government has come up with these rules. You have to deal with the labor union. That means you're not negotiating freely. You're negotiating under duress. Because according to certain pieces of legislation like the Wagner Act, employers simply cannot resist unionization. And this act also defines various unfair labor practices. And the way it's defined is the labor practices can only be done by the employer. Whenever there's an unfair labor practice, the assumption is it's the employer. It's as if a labor union is simply not capable of an unfair labor practice. And so the justification for this kind of legislation